So I'm going to introduce our speaker. And again, this is session 13, Environmental Health Issues and Trends in North Dakota. And our speaker is Dr. Amber Lyon-Colbert. She's an assistant professor in the MPH program with the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at UND. She is a PhD in public health, specializing in environmental and occupational health, and an MS degree in biology with a concentration in environmental microbiology. Dr. Lyon-Colbert's research interests are interdisciplinary, combining both environmental health broadly as well as human health outcomes, and specifically investigating water quality and human health. She's been teaching for 8 years and enjoys connecting with students.
So environmental health is a really large topic, very difficult to cover inclusively in a 45-minute presentation. However, I'm going to do my best to talk about some of the kind of top level or main issues with environmental health and how we deal with environmental health basically in North Dakota, what sort of trends we're seeing, as well as give you some resources to look up environmental health trends in air quality, in water quality, agriculture throughout the state of North Dakota. So as Johnny said, I am an assistant professor in the MPH program, specializing in environmental health. I work in the health management and policy track specialization within the MPH program. And I advise master's students as well as PhD students in Indigenous health. And my research does focus on water quality primarily. However, this last year I've had a large statewide seroprevalence study looking at COVID antibodies. So that's kind of a little bit new, but since I focused quite a bit on infectious disease in my master's, as well as some epidemiology in my PhD program, it kind of falls in line with my interests. So this is one of my favorite quotes and something that I like to remind people, especially students, is that we do the best we can until we know better. And then once we know better, we do better. So I really feel that this statement by Maya Angelou applies to environmental health. It applies to a lot of aspects of our life in general, but really with environmental health, when we know what's going on, we're able to make changes to do better. And that's really where the management and policy side of what I do comes in, because once we know what those problems are, we're able to help implement policy changes in order to protect health. So today, the topics that I'm going to cover overall, environmental health, what is it? Exposure science, a bit about toxicology, epigenetics, air quality in North Dakota, water quality in North Dakota, agriculture in North Dakota, and then what are the emerging environmental health trends in North Dakota? So environmental health helps us to better understand the role of environmental factors in human health and disease outcomes. And today we're looking primarily in the state of North Dakota. So this can be applied to any area, any geographical area. Environmental health research considers what happens inside your body as chemicals are processed by analyzing chemicals in the air that you breathe, the water that you drink, and the things that you touch, such as soil, or things. Sorry, we've got a puppy in the house. I'll just hold him. Environmental factors can also be external to the body, such as sunlight, looking at things such as skin cancer, mold, things that we may be breathing in that might be in our building, other pollutants like lead and paint, internal factors such as diet choice, our metabolism, and stress. So these are all encompassing environmental health factors. So exposure science is a part of environmental health that looks at the study of our interaction with these environmental factors and how that affects our body as well as our health outcomes. So the research in exposure science really aims to determine the type, the level, and the combination of exposures that people experience and how those exposures affect human health and disease over a lifetime. So one of these examples of exposure science would be to look at the exposome. So some of these terms might be old hat to you, might be something that you've heard of, you've taken a class in, but for others of you, this might be some new terminology to think about exposure science or the exposome. So I'm hoping that we'll have a class here on exposure science at UND in the near future. And we're going to look at exposome here. So toxicology is an important part of environmental health. It's a field of science that helps to understand what the harmful effects of chemicals are, to look at different substances or situations and what those effects are on people, animals, and the environment. So some refer to toxicology as the science of safety. As a field, it's evolved from a science that focuses on studying poisons and adverse effects to chemical exposures, to the science devoted to studying safety. So with toxicology, you may have heard something such as the dose makes the poison, really meaning that anything could be harmful in a large enough dose. So with toxicology, the effects or the goal of environmental health is really to look at what that dose is, what is our minimum exposure to a chemical in the environment without having or before having a health outcome. And these doses, such as lead in the water or phthalates, this is something that we look at and monitor for the most sensitive of populations. So we want to make sure through observational studies and through history that the exposure level is low enough it's not going to cause an adverse health outcome. And so we look at that outcome in pregnant women, in children, in immune compromised individuals, and in the elderly. So these would be our sensitive population groups where a larger dose may negatively affect them quicker than a healthy adult. So we want to set our standards at the lowest dose that would negatively affect one of our sensitive population groups so that then all population is protected. So actually I want to go back to toxicology. So part of the research with toxicology and figuring out that lowest dose, obviously with environmental health, we're not going to have the type of research where we expose people to chemicals and then see where the adverse effects lie. And a lot of times with these toxic chemicals or environmental pollutants, it's a long-term process. And this is part of the problem in kind of getting buy-in on environmental health, is that a lot of times the chemicals that we're exposed to in the environment are going to be carcinogens or things that cause cancer. Well, those are causing cancer over possibly 10, 20, 30 years. And so your risk of cancer may increase because you're exposed to a particular toxin. However, it's harder to prove that association, and it's harder to make this a priority when it's something that could cause a long-term health effect like cancer, rather than an immediate infectious disease risk where you're going to drink the water and develop cholera. So this is where environmental health really has a difficult time kind of looking at that observation, studying the data and looking kind of retrospectively back on a population to see where their exposure started, what that exposure was, and what the health outcome is. And so we would start with the health outcome, look backwards, rather than starting with a population, exposing them to a chemical or toxin, and then looking forward. So that would not be something that we would do. So the exposome, as I mentioned before, this is really a fairly new term within the last couple of decades. And this can be defined as the measure of all exposures of an individual in a lifetime and really how those exposures relate to their health. So the thing with environmental health that we know is that it may not just be radon exposure that led to a lung cancer case. You may have a history of lung cancer in your family. Or you may have radon exposure, but maybe you smoked for a few years. So then we're looking at the outcome of lung cancer and trying to kind of tease out what factors actually led to the development of that lung cancer. And so could it be a poor diet, lack of exercise, stress, family history, all of the things that you've been exposed to in your lifetime, all of the chemicals you've been exposed to, possibly you've lived in different places where you've had different exposure. Maybe there was lead in one place, there was asbestos in another, there's radon in another, uranium. So how do we really kind of tease out all of those factors and figure out what is the cause or maybe the biggest contributor to that health outcome? So this is something that can be difficult in environmental epidemiology. So an individual's exposure actually begins before birth, and that includes all of their exposure to everything that their mother intook, all of their genetic factors, all of their characteristics, even stress that a mother undergoes while pregnant can contribute to that particular child's exposome. So your exposures actually begin from conception on. So moving forward from the exposome, we move into epigenetics. So this is another kind of large topic within environmental health. And so again, we're just touching briefly on all of these kind of large topics within environmental health to give you a general knowledge of environmental health. And I hope that it spurs further interest where you're like, I'm interested in this. I want to know more about the exposome. I want to know more about epigenetics. I want to know more about toxicology and exposure science. So epigenetics is the study of how your behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. So unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible and do not change your DNA sequence, but they can change how your body reads a DNA sequence. So one of, I think, the best examples of this, maybe you haven't had genetics, or maybe you're wondering, well, how does this happen? Or I don't buy into this. I like to give the example of the BRCA gene. So that's the breast cancer gene. So potentially an individual has this gene, and maybe they have a family history of breast cancer. However, that gene can become basically activated if this person has high stress, drinks, or smokes. So that's another big one, is the smoking. So those genes can become activated where basically now they're more at risk for cancer. So they had the gene for it potentially, but then their environmental exposures caused a greater risk of the disease. Epigenetics can affect the way that your genes are expressed through DNA methylation, histone modification, and non-coding RNA. So I provided a link for more information if you want to get into the science of all of this. Or again, I'd recommend trying to find and take an epigenetics course. It's a lot of information and very technical, so we'll go high level for today. So I want to bring this around to North Dakota. So air quality, North Dakota is actually a pretty good state for air quality, I would say. We're very rural, which means we have less people per square mile than a lot of other metropolitan or urban areas. And that's good because that also means we have less cars, and cars are the leading cause of pollution for air quality. So in 2019, there were 7 out of 7 standards that were measured in North Dakota that were below or at the National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And again, I've provided some links here so that you can go through and look and see, okay, what are they testing for? Why are we testing it? What are the standards? And how do we decide what the standards are? So most of the time, our standards are set by the EPA. And then the states have the ability to either set the standards at the level of the EPA, or they can lower that standard. But typically, they're not able to increase that standard. So ambient or atmospheric air quality refers to the concentration of pollutants in the outdoor air. So here we're talking about outdoor air. Indoor air pollution is a little bit different. We can talk about that in a minute. Ambient air quality is regulated by the United States Environmental Protection Agency and then maintained by the states, as I discussed, through the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which is a set of guidelines on acceptable concentrations for nitrogen dioxide, ground level ozone, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter. So we've got PM 2.5 and PM 10. So it's different sizes of air pollution, basically. Carbon monoxide and lead. So we have lead in the water, but we also have lead in the air. The goal is to protect the public, again, especially those vulnerable populations. So in air quality, we would be looking at children, the elderly, people with existing chronic illnesses such as asthma or COPD, and wanting to protect our most sensitive populations. So again, here's some sources. I believe the slides will be shared, and you can go through and look at what those air quality standards look like across the state. But for purposes of time, I want to keep moving forward right now. So air quality, we have point source as well as non-point source emissions. So what is that? Point source is outdoor air pollutants, which are emitted directly from single identifiable fixed locations. So if a factory is releasing potential toxins into the air, we see an increase in those 7 measurable air quality standards, and maybe we're able to trace that back through some epidemiology and observation. Our common point sources include large industrial facilities like oil refineries, electric power, and sewage treatment plants or airports, as well as small industrial, non-industrial, and commercial facilities like dry cleaners, gas stations, and livestock farms. So although we don't maybe have as many cars in North Dakota or transportation emissions, we do have industry. We do have electrical power. We do have sewage treatment plants. We do have airports. So we do have some forms of point source emissions. Our non-point source example would be vehicles. So if we have a lot of vehicles driving around and our air quality worsens for the day, it's not that we point to one particular car and say your car was the cause of air pollution for this day. We just know we identify it as a group vehicles, so it's not a point source. So again, I've provided some links here to go through and look, and I'm kind of scared to click on the link that I won't be able to get back, but I'm going to give it a try. Okay, Joni, can you see this okay? Okay. I'm not sure if you guys can see this. I'm hoping you guys can see this. Please speak up, somebody, if you can't. So you can actually look. I'm sure that we have people from the DEQ. I'm sorry, what was that?
Amber,
yes.
We still see your slides.
Okay.
It didn't switch. You would need to stop sharing and then share the other window that you have open.
Okay, no problem. I will quickly stop sharing and then share. Let's see here. Okay. That's okay. The links are there for you to go ahead and look at, but the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality updates regularly the air quality in North Dakota. You can focus in on a specific area. You can say, what is the air quality of my city today? And a lot of times, I know growing up in California, we had air quality alerts basically, where we would have no burn days. And I know we get the no burn days here as well, too, but it was fairly often in California that we wouldn't be able to light a fire, have a barbecue. A lot of times there would be an advisory to carpool or to ride your bike if you were healthy, or walk potentially to work or school, rather than to take your car, so that we could try to reduce those emissions. Now, again, anybody that was considered a part of a sensitive population, so had asthma or COPD or chronic illness, very young children, the elderly, were advised to stay indoors during those poor air quality days. And it really depended on the level of emissions for the day and what the air quality was, whether or not it would be recommended that you could do something like ride your bike, or whether it was recommended that you stay inside.
Say, Amber, I just wanted to share one other idea here for you.
Yeah.
Since it's not working to share that, if you want anybody to be able to pull up those links live while you're presenting, you could put the links into the chat.
Oh, okay.
That's another option for you if you want.
Okay. I will put those in just a minute. I don't want to screw anything up here, I'm afraid. Okay. So we'll move away from air quality and talk about drinking water quality in North Dakota. So drinking water quality has been a passion of mine, and really something that I feel that everybody deserves good quality drinking water, where basically that means you have access to drinking water that is not going to cause illness if you drink it. This is just, I mean, it's something that in my master's degree, I was working in a water quality lab, and I was doing a lot of molecular microbiology, identifying, basically looking at source tracking of fecal bacteria in water. And I would joke that they weren't going to let me back into Hawaii because I identified that there was some human fecal pollution in some of the estuaries there. But the passion for drinking water really came from a documentary that I saw while I was in school, that was called Blue Gold. And it really, or the water wars. So it really talked about how valuable water is, and how it's just really our most important resource, and something that we need to protect. So we really only have about 3% of all of our water that is actually drinkable. So when we look at it like that, it really becomes important to try to protect that water. So it's not just an issue of whether we are in a state of drought, which again, growing up in California, we had a lot of droughts. I know I've heard people in North Dakota say, well, we've got plenty of water. We do have plenty of water, but it's also looking at being socially responsible for all people around us as well. And does everybody around us have access to water? And then if you're on a private well, so we've got the municipal versus the non-municipal water systems. Our municipal water systems are those city water systems that really take care of all of our drinking water quality for us. So if we have municipal water and running water in our homes, and we're not worried about lead pipes, our drinking water should be fairly safe. Now, if we've got a well that's pulling up groundwater, we may be pulling up other contaminants with that water. That maybe we're not even aware of, maybe things we've never even heard of, or are just really not on our radar. So aside from microbiological contaminants such as bacteria, we could also be looking at arsenic, which is a big groundwater contaminant that could lead to arsenicosis or cancer if you have continued exposure, or death even if you have a large enough acute exposure. So does anybody know where our drinking water comes from in, say, in Grand Forks or in Fargo? So actually in Grand Forks, it comes from a combination of the Red River and Red Lake River. And they basically look to see which one has the best qualities at the time, and then go with that one before treatment. So groundwater pollution, which is something that I'm really focusing on right now. Again, that non-municipal, typically well water. We have pollution from waste storage or from treatment facilities. There's chemical and industrial activities, septic systems that can leak which was the problem in Hawaii that I mentioned. There were some leaky pipes that was leaking huge human sewage into the estuaries where people were visiting and playing. So it's important to do some of that source tracking and find out if you have pollution and what type of pollution you have, because maybe pollution from ducks or birds or other wildlife, it may be a potential problem, yes, but that human pollution is going to be a higher potential health problem, because now we're looking at something that could definitely be transmissible from human to human. We've got sewers, oil pipelines, possible accidental spills. We've got oil spills, we've got saltwater spills. We have irrigation, mine drainage. So uranium from mine drainage is one of the big things that I'm just starting to look at now. Farm chemicals, things like fertilizers. These are not things that you want to have in your drinking water. Manure, substances that are applied to roads, all things, again, you don't want to drink. So the problem, as I stated before, is that ground pollution is usually slow to be discovered. And it's not typically discovered until potentially years down the road after people have been exposed for a longer period of time. So some of the drinking water quality issues that we have in the state of North Dakota, again, as I stated, uranium is something I'm just starting to look into. We've had uranium mines here in North Dakota. There's a lot of lands that have been contaminated with uranium that have potential links to cancer. And Dr. Dawn Warren and Dr. Nicole Redvers and a few people from New Mexico and Arizona and I had done a study just recently that was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, looking at uranium exposure in American Indian communities and what our policies are in defining those lowest limits of uranium. Because again, we don't know what we don't know. And once we know, we do better. So we don't know what the minimum level of uranium exposure is before we see health outcomes in our most sensitive populations. It's something we're working on. But again, we're not going to expose people to uranium to see what the health issues are. So we have to look at observational studies, and that takes longer. But we have high levels of uranium in drinking water aquifers that have been identified in the High Plains and Central Valley areas of the country. And one of those areas most recently was Pine Ridge, South Dakota. So we also, another issue that I'm looking into is nitrates and coliform bacteria in groundwater sources. So we have nitrates that occur naturally in both surface and groundwater. We can look at total coliforms, which is a type of bacteria found in the gut. And it's a group of bacteria that's present all around us. So E. coli would be a coliform bacteria. Most are not dangerous to human health. So even E. coli, we have a good natural E. coli that's found in our gut and is actually healthy for us. It's our resident bacteria and it protects our intestines. However, there are some forms of E. coli, the hemorrhagic, the 0157H7 strain of E. coli is a really bad type of E. coli for us. So we want to make sure that we don't have bad types of E. coli or any type of coliform bacteria. So when we're looking at coliform bacteria, a lot of times we're looking for a group of bacteria, the Enterobacteriaceae bacteria, and anything that shows up. So if we have, some form of coliform bacteria, it also means there could be potential bad bacteria from our guts. So we want to make sure that we have good and healthy drinking water free from coliform bacteria. So high levels of nitrate and coliform bacteria in well water can result from improper well construction, which is why we have guidelines for well construction and permits and the proper people to drill a well. We have well location, overuse of chemical fertilizers, or improper disposal of human and animal waste. Again, this is why we have guidelines, why we have policy, why we have, a right way to do things and we don't just dump our waste outside or drill a well wherever we want. So it's really getting this education out to the general public and saying, hey, it's not that we're trying to be, we're not trying to tell you what to do or how to live, but also we want to make sure that you are safe. And we do that through our guidelines and policies. And then so briefly, I have agriculture in North Dakota. So some of the largest agricultural issues that we face in North Dakota as an agricultural state is that we've had a lot of saltwater spills. And so our saltwater spills have been the result of fracking. So we have a lot of fracking in the state. I'm not saying necessarily that I'm against it, but we do have a byproduct of fracking that is similar to saltwater, except for it also has additional chemicals. Now, these chemicals are typically proprietary blend of chemicals in order to extract the oil from the ground. And so this isn't water that's drinkable. High salt content and a lot of chemicals that have been analyzed. Some reports show arsenic within those chemicals. A lot of things necessarily that we wouldn't want to drink or grow our food in. So with these high saltwater spills, especially in icy conditions, it's affected thousands of acres of agricultural land. And when that land is affected by the saltwater spill, it has to be dug up, and it's typically unusable for many years afterwards. So this becomes a huge issue to farmers and to the agricultural community, as well as looking at our food supply and our ability to remain one of the top agricultural states. So it is something important to take a closer look at and see how can we minimize those saltwater spills? And is there anything that we can do to kind of counterbalance or help to better remediate those spills in a faster way so that we can get the land back to a state of being fertile and able to grow food in a healthy way. And then if we look kind of a little bit more on the occupational side of environmental health, we have a lot of grain bin accidents. So these are large grain bin silos, and we have wheat, corn, soy, a lot of agriculture again in the state of North Dakota. There have been a lot of grain bin accidents where people have fallen into the grain bins while they were trying to work on them or do something, and it kind of encompasses the person, and you're not really able to, swim in a grain bin. So there's been a lot of suffocation deaths, and it's something that I think we need to do better to protect people. So using harnesses while they're climbing in and out of grain bins, and kind of have some better education for the farming and agricultural community on how to avoid these type of accidents. Also protecting our minor workers in agricultural areas would be another big concern of mine. So I've provided another couple of links here to look at some environmental trends in North Dakota, as well as, again, that North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality link, so that if you have further interest, you can scroll through these links and look at what are our environmental trends. Are we increasing or decreasing in air pollution and water quality in our agricultural accidents? So there's a lot out there, and I would encourage you to get involved. We do have the environmental health section. It's environmental health and emergency preparedness for the North Dakota Public Health Association, which I am currently section chair of. And I'd like to get a larger environmental health presence in the state and have quarterly meetings. So if that's something that you're interested in, I would encourage you to reach out to me or to sign up and really to get involved. I like to say, with the state of North Dakota, there's so much environmentally that can be done. I think it's really at a point where, we can make small changes that would really have an impact in the state of North Dakota. So I would love to work on that with you. And if you have questions, I will take those now.
We have about 3 minutes for questions, and there are 5 questions in the Q&A. So
Okay.
I'm going to let you pick and choose which ones you want to answer. And then others, if you want to respond to later, we can go from there.
Okay, so restate the amount of water in percent that is available for use. So about 70% of the globe is currently water. The majority of that is salt water or is tied up in polar ice caps. So we have about 3% of fresh water, and really between 1 to 2% that is actually drinkable of that fresh water. Let's see here. Tilling by farmers affect the safety of our aquifers and drinking water. So it really depends on how close they are to the drinking water source. So you always want to be upstream of something like a farm. So I know pig farming, and there was a new farm that was, kind of a source of issue in North Dakota a few years ago because of the potential downstream effects of that farm, the fertilizers, the waste, the chemicals. Those are all things to consider. And I think that it can definitely affect the water quality. And so again, education, and then increased testing for the areas that are around some of those farms if they're near a water source. So I think it would be particularly important for those that are near a water source that are doing, that have groundwater sources. So anything that's municipal, even if it's pulled from the Red River or the Red Lake River, it's going to be treated before it's sent back out into the homes. But anything that could potentially get into the drinking water system that would be groundwater is not treated. Those would be really our biggest concerns. I've got a question here about electromagnetic field exposure and sensitivity for cell phones, Wi-Fi, etc. That's not my area of research. I really don't know. I know that there has been quite a bit of study around this area. I've read a couple of articles, particularly in grad school, and there's been some association with, I know, brain tumors, but I don't know if they've actually proved a causality. So we have a difference between there's a possible association or there's a cause and effect. With environmental health, like I said, it's really difficult to prove the causality of an exposure. So smoking and lung cancer, as well as radon and lung cancer, are really some of the only things that we've proven an exposure and an outcome. So I think that it would take some time and unfortunately further observation before we would have that sort of data to be able to say that there's an association between the electromagnetic field and health outcomes.
Thank you to everyone for attending, and Amber, thank you so much for your presentation.